Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for coming out on this rainy Sunday afternoon to do what you do on a rainy Sunday afternoon, which is think about words and poetry and all sorts of things like that. It's wonderful to be up here at the front on these spinny chairs with Kevin and with Tom, who I'm sure need fairly little introduction, but we'll still do a bit of an introduction to both of them. My name's Adam, and I'm sort of the shepherd of the conversation for the next 50 minutes, although I'm sure I won't have to do very much talking, as there's lots to be said from the two to my right, and lots to be heard from you. So the way we're going to do the next 50 minutes is we're going to hear from Kevin and hear from Tom. They're going to share some poems with you. Then we're going to have a little bit of a chat. I have a few questions ready, and I'd like to throw it over to you. I have a feeling that some of you in the audience have thought about the poems that both of these men have written. And so if there's things that you want to hear about their perspectives on the world, you want to hear about what's in their poetry, be ready with your questions, and hopefully we can throw to you relatively quickly. And then we'll end off with a couple of poems from Tom and Kevin to send you off into the world for the rest of your weekend. All right, so without further ado, Kevin Shaw was born and raised in London, Ontario. His poems have appeared in the Malahat Review, the Gay Lesbian Review, Contemporary Verse 2, Grain, and the Fiddlehead. He received the ARC Poetry Magazine Poem of the Year Award and the grand prize in the PRISM International Poetry Contest. He recently completed his PhD in English at the University of Western Ontario, and recently this book that I'm reading out of the back of, Smaller Hours. Kevin.
Thanks. I think I'm actually going to stand up here.
And so while Kevin stands up there, I'm just going to ask Tom, these guys know each other, so I'm just wondering, is there anything that's not in that bio that you think others should know?
Impeccable fashion sense. He's really nailed the black t-shirt and blazer fashion, which is all the rage.
Inspired by you.
One thing, Kevin and I are in the same writing group, so some of the poems that I'm going to read it's fun to read with Kevin because he's looked at them and offered feedback, and my poems have become better by them knowing Kevin.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks all for being here. I'm going to read a few poems from Smaller Hours. And kind of the fun thing about I'm from London and reading in London is that you'll get a lot of the references to some of the local spaces I write about, especially in the first part of the book. This poem is called Victoria Park, and there's a few poems that take up with different parks that are in the city. I find them fascinating for the way kind of layer history in multiple ways. And the other thing that strikes me a lot about Victoria Park is the way the kids are playing all around all of these military installations, right, climbing all over the tank. And so I think that was the image that kind of got me started. So Victoria Park. The children play on a Sherman tank called the Holy Roller, sighting ley lines through the park towards St. Peter's door. 16, I watch the cenotaph shadow march its sundown parade, while pairs of men in white shirts stop to ask if I've been saved. I think of sunlight, stain fighters, my mother folding boxers with the bone in the crook of her neck, as she murmurs her observations of me to the doctor. Have I been tilting at clocks again? St. Peter answers in the pealing bell at dusk. Our Mother Marian, Our Lady of Sorrows, still worries what befalls some boys in the river and parks. Meanwhile, city maintenance men string Christmas lights across the imported forest, as in 1882 when the park first went electric, and 7,000 faces turned Nickelodeon at the switch, and we other Victorians bowed beneath the steepled trees and hid. I meet the boy from school at the Southwest Cannon, installed after the siege of Sevastopol. He leads me round to a bench in the evergreens. Mom warned me against their shadows. And as the cathedral sounds the hour, I bloody my tongue against his brace's barbed wire. A pair of idlers in a copse that the police tell to move along, we surrender. Flirting with fusiliers, smiling on grenadiers, these are the joys of a garrison town. Looking back, I can't rebuild demolished barracks without playing soldier, so I run across the melted rink, drowning my image in the water. I should mention two of the lines in the last stanza I stole from a local poet writing back in the 1840s when this was especially a garrison town. This next one is called Turing's Time Machine. In response to the story of Alan Turing, the code breaker during World War II, when I was working on many of the poems, it was around the time The Imitation Game had come out, and then I had gone on to read other biographies and documentaries around Turing. Became really fascinated. So Turing's Time Machine. The ticker tapes have run out, swallowing ones and zeros, while from a perfect and pink aporia dangles the hell's end of a cigarette that hisses goodbye. Goodbye, dear. Goodbye to all that in an ink blot. I'm crossing old circuits, secret and serendipitous, but to the naked eye, merely a sight to hack a beery slash in the Navy hours. Supposed utopia forsaken, the flip side of a fast one, a fist or life. The graffiti curates obscenity in water closets. The toes tap epistles in a horror's code. The living history of silence is counted in the vibratory instance between chapel bells. I'm held under suspension bridges, or I'm standing aside-eyed at love, hovering around the urinals, attuned to the signals, those fleeting gazes gone, to the eye-white narcissi of the neon. Then, in a flash, I see men safe in the palm of my hand, and all our causeways come undone. In the bar, we text our muscled apparitions while our want is numbered. One more for the night, and then we swallow the 0 hour. I even wrote the page numbers down. I'm still doing the flipping back and forth thing. This next poem is called Occlusion Effect, which is the term for when you have something kind of blocking the outer part of your ear canal and you kind of hear an echo of your own voice or chewing. So, occlusion effect. I kept the memory of my body's discovery, a stone glassed against adolescence. I survived an extended dinosaur epoch. Age 10, 11, and still I dug in my parents' garden, seeking fossils in my lost trinkets. I found a cat's eye in my old He-Man figurine. That summer, a guide at the pinery told me all this here used to be water, as if a single absolution came and went with the glacier. I treaded time by taking drags of the undertow, my mother's face on the shore, there then not there, until she waved me in with her red book reflecting the sun in the glossy pool of its cover. All this here used to be water. My parents married in '74 and parted that December. Same difference, so many bottle caps in the reversing current. In her jewelry box, my mother kept a rock, the outline of a shell on its smooth gray surface. While I dangle her gold clip-ons beside my buzzed scalp, slowly turn my face in the mirror, I never pressed the shell in the rock to my newly bedazzled ears or listened for the echo of a bygone ocean. Summer of '96, summer of dissonance. I kept the memory of the body's discovery, a stone glassed against adolescence. Herb Baumeister of Indianapolis, a married father of 3 who murdered 11 gay men and buried them in his backyard at the Fox Hollow Farm, drove north on the I-75 that July, a river of ghosted headlights in the rearview mirror. Campers found him dead at the pinery, a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Years later, I think of him as I plant rosemary on my balcony. That's for remembrance, Ophelia says, not long before drowning. So many summers have lapsed. I remind myself to look up the meaning of antediluvian. Harder still to date my father's going, the instant apogee of a wave's ebb, or the moment I gain the knowledge my as yet unspoken longing would risk some violence. Potting reminds me of Baumeister's son, around my age, who discovered the first skull in the woods and brought the bones to his mother. She claimed later to police and reporters she suspected nothing. A childhood news hour replays, but the anchor's submerged. All this here used to be water. And I'm just gonna end with one more poem. Slightly less disturbing. Depressing. And we're back here on more local terrain. This is called The Flood of 37. We trace the last of the high water mark that salts the city like a ring of sweat. And Sons is all that's left of the old sign as closing time drains the gay bar. We shake the end of our invisible ink and look for lifts in the rain. As all the cabs extinguish their wet and yellow halos, downtown's a cliche of April. We walk up Dundas Street, trading directions instead of names, the vague pre-dawn disclosure. I want to be alone if the sun rises, but we can't decide who's closer, and so we're wanderers at the meridian, on the edge of our small and violet disaster. We don't want to go to bed but shiver at the abatement, shouldering this dam against the other's inevitable disappointment. I sip the city's drunk history, air hopped at the brewery, and I imagine my apartment flooded and all my paperbacks swollen and dispersed, my pills dissolved and meaningless as grist, the empty bed a sunken ship. The river has fallen, and I too want to be swept. The air is easy deviant. But I must believe that instead of drowning, we'd hatch some great escapes, and illicit trysts would begin again somewhere else, under a false death's presumed innocence. We'd overturn the optician's billboard, use it for a skiff, and staying the course of press-on stars, we'd drift and drift, anonymous. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Now we're over to Tom.
I don't know why I said I'd go second.
I feel like we should just ask you a whole bunch of questions now, but I think we'll let Tom read. So Tom Cull lives in London, Ontario, where he teaches, writes, and roams the Thames River. He has a PhD in English literature and has taught at Western University and Fanshawe College. His poems have appeared on LTC buses and in newspapers, but are more regularly found in the inboxes of patient and gracious friends. This is his first collection of poems, this here, the What the Badgers Said. And Tom is also the current poet laureate in London. And his first full-length collection, Bad Animals, will be out in spring 2008 from Insomniac Press.
Thank you. So we talked a little bit about the poems that we were going to read and kind of chose poems, I think, that we thought might dialogue a little bit with each other. The first poem I'm going to read is After Rivers. And it's a response to a triptych by Nick Cote, 3 photographs of the Thames River. That was part of a show at Western, and it was on a wall, basically, that if you just step through that wall, you'd be about 10 feet away from the actual Thames. So this is after, and the name of that triptych was City Parks. So this is After Rivers, After City Parks triptych, photographed on paper by Nick Cote. 1. I've waited below the Hunt Weir, where the dam drops the river into vortices of water, pinning drunken swimmers by their shoulders to the bottom. Lowhead Dam, drowning machines, they're called, but the fishing's good. I've been pulled by swirling eddies, an 18-foot pole in hand, fashioned from pipes bought at Home Depot, a fishing net bolted to the end. In August, the water is low. I net plastic bottles, cans, Tim Hortons cups, a flip-flop diaper, needles caught in the elliptical froth. Anglers eye me cautiously. One pulls a carp from the depths, its carnival colors like backyard koi. I catch a neon pink stuffy snagged on a branch and toss it back to shore. The river, too. The river transports to the Pacific our dollar store pottage. We'll live there soon, fog catchers, salted, dried, and hung, building our empire on flotsam, jetsam, filtered by rivers. Ce n'est pas une rivière. Outside, it slithers by beyond the gallery glass, past the workers rebuilding the London dike. But the waters will have their way. They will again break these banks, drown us in our beds, carry our bodies aloft downstream, jostled like bloated frat boys in blow-up sumo suits. It is the dawning of the age of aquariums. What does the river convey? It is hard to say. wood, cement, grain, rice, chair, inkjet, Copic markers, watercolors, crayon, rag and paper, acrylic, charcoal, faux fur stuffing, glass beads, duct tape, printed on, etched on, cut out, glazed. Your brush will paint blue-green algae on the canvas of a perch's belly. It is hard to say Askunasippi, Antler River, La Tranche, the Thames, Dashkan ZB, all the tangled narratives in the abandoned place. At the Pinery. We collect every stone, our pockets swollen, ready to split. Our boy feeds gulls the remains of our picnic supper. We drink wine in plastic cups, watch the sun burn a hole in the lake. The water's high on the beach, jostles us. My son holds on as we wade beyond where he can touch. I point to his mom back on shore. What do you think? She has a happy face, he says, then shouts, your face is happy, Mama. Last week, the boy's other dad died alone in a room in Istanbul. We had to tell him. He asked, are you sure he's dead? Did anyone check? This is where I tell you about him. Golden skin, olive-shaped blue eyes, lithe and limber, muscles gathering. He lets the waves push and pull, then karate chops and kicks, singing to himself alone in the surf. On our way back to the car, we ignore the signs that say stay off the dunes, pick wildflowers, and hide them in the trunk. I spend a lot of time at the YMCA, and in the dressing room of the YMCA Men's Plus. It's an interesting space to spend time. I think that if the men in there knew I was writing poems about my experiences in this place, I would be, my membership would be revoked. This is called The Dinks Are Out. The Dinks. That's the intended.
I thought people were going to join along.
They need to warm up. Let's do some heavy work. Okay. The Dinks are out at the YMCA Men's Plus change room, towels and flip-flops, and Members Plus. A piebald parliament of corpora carvernosa and a carnicis clutes deputation from all ends of the earth. All hues, sizes, and attitudes. Some swing low, sweet chariots, hang like an egg in a sock. Others are more forward-thinking, straight and to the point. Some sit back, toad in a hole. It appears others were simply left at home, rarely seen, like some prehistoric fish floating in the midnight zone. Here also are never nudes. Eyes fixed on the tiles, conspicuous objectors like sauerkrauts at a sausage party. The men take off their business suits, starched shirts, and crisp ties give way to canvases of skin and flesh, stretched over muscle and bone, dappled by the sauna, blanched by the hot tub. Men become boys, talk sports, trash talk, compare aches and pains, bitch about the wife and the water pressure. Odd confessions can be heard through the locker doors. Barry's put out poison for the neighborhood cats. Jim's sorry, but Trump's the only one who tells it like it is. The Dinks, on the other hand, keep their own counsel, hang in stupor, feet from one another like fellow travelers locked in cryogenic sleep, dreaming of vast carnivals, muscled candy, cotton candy makers, spin airy clouds of neon pink fur spilling over, covering everything, the peaks and the valleys of the roller coaster engulfed by a great and leveling swell. It takes a bit of an odd turn there. Is that to get me off? Okay, this is a poem that was a response to, Andy, help me out. Who did I respond to in Word Horde?
Trevor Ames.
Trevor Ames. wrote a piece about the painter, now I'm forgetting, Hirst. Damien Hirst. You know Damien Hirst? He did like the skull encrusted with diamonds. He's also famous for a painting, a sculpture called The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. And it's a tiger shark that he caught or had people catch, fill it full of preservatives, and then put it in a glass container, glass case, which he shows. That it his first one started to decay, as they do. So he went out and caught another one and killed it and stuffed it, whatever. Again, these are of course endangered animals. And another famous one of his paintings is called Flies. It's called Armageddon, and it's flies on resin, on canvas, and that's literally what it is. It's probably about the size of roughly that squared, and it's just all dead flies that are stuck. And so you look at it, just looks from far back, it just looks like a black canvas, but it's covered in dead flies that are stuck there. And the epigraph to this poem is a quote from Hirst talking about this piece, the flies of the flies piece, the one with these millions of, probably hundreds of thousands of flies stuck to this canvas. Damien Hirst. I think it was Thomas Hobbes who said people are like flies brushed off a wall. I like that metaphorically. Your whole life could be like points in space, like nearly nothing. If you stand back far enough, you think people are just like flies. Like the cycle of a fly is like your own life. When you make that connection with the painting, it's like all the people in the world who die in 100 years. That amount of death is pretty black. The physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living. The physical impossibility of death in the mind of all the people in the world. The physical impossibility of death in the mind if you stand far back enough. The physical impossibility when you make that connection with the painting. The physical impossibility of death when you think people are just like flies. The physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living the cycle of a fly. The physical impossibility like points in space if you stand back far enough. The physical impossibility of all the people in the world who die in 100 years. The physical impossibility of someone living is pretty black. The physical amount of death is pretty black, like all the people in the world who die just like flies. The physical amount of a fly is like your own life, like nearly nothing if you stand back far enough. The physical impossibility when you make that connection with the painting is pretty black in the mind of someone living. The physical impossibility is like all the people who said people are like flies brushed off a wall. The physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living back far enough is like all the people in the world. I like that metaphorically. I like that metaphorically when you make that connection with the painting. The physical impossibility when Thomas Hobbes brushed flies off a wall if you stand back far enough is like all the people who die in 100 years of death. The physical impossibility of your whole life could be like a fly when you make that connection. The physical impossibility of death. The physical impossibility of death I like. The physical impossibility of death is like your own, like all the people in the mind of someone living. The physical impossibility of Thomas Hobbes is like your own life. Like your own life is like your own life. The physical impossibility of death when you think people are just like flies. The physical impossibility of the cycle of a fly is like your own life when you make that connection. I like that metaphorically when you make that connection. I like that metaphorically if you stand back far enough. Final one I'll read, collective nouns. You know what a collective noun is, right? It's the noun that you give a collection of something like a flock of birds, give me another example.
Murder of crows.
That one's actually wrong.
Sorry.
My poem corrects it. Collective nouns. A phalanx of pangolin, a powder of moths, a stupid of aardvarks, a failure of tarpons, a Gideon of badgers, a passion of fire ants, a slut of peacocks, a turd of capitalists, a Bunyan of Floridians, a Charmin of dung beetles, a URL of trolls, an upload of dick pics, a Pollock of dingleberries, a Red Bull of owls, a scissor of egrets, a tuna melt of historical materialists, a Polly Shore of method actors, a Vergule of postmodernists, a murder of crowbars, a lick of nipples, a threnody of hyenas, a regret of whales, a poet of dodos. Thank you.
Thank you to Tom, and thanks to Kevin. So maybe we'll just start off with just a few questions, and as you hear me ask a few questions, start forming your own. Maybe start with Kevin. And I had not been introduced to your work until recently. I was at the launch of your book, and I was sitting beside a friend who had never been to anything poetry related, and you opened in some ways by saying, this will be part of my homoerotic reimagining of the city of London. And I sort of looked sideways at him, and he sort of looked sideways at me, and I wondered, have I brought you somewhere that you're not used to being? And it made me think that in a certain way, just the very act of reimagining acts as a bit of an activist move. And I'm wondering, for you, is there a place for activism in your work, and where does it show up for you?
Yeah, I mean, that first part there, I take on kind of London as a subject. I kind of nickname them my hometown reckoning poems, because I've had a kind of like fraught relationship with the city, and just trying to, I mean, I think that's the kind of the queer perspective is just one kind of way of troubling the city's history, right? In terms of like, you could look at the military and the kind of colonial history. So I guess for me it comes out in the kind of queer poetics. I'm really interested in censorship. And I was writing a dissertation on censorship and queer writing in Canada, and around the same time I was working on the poetry collection, and I think that was also kind of running through my mind too, about how do you kind of reclaim a history that's been less visible or less heard. So those two things, I think, working in tandem.
And Tom, for you, a big part of your public persona in the city is involvement in certain causes, whether that's looking after the Thames River or being present in community spaces. For you, does the work that you do come out in your poetry? Does your poetry inform the work you do in the community? And what's the relationship?
Yeah, I think the relationship is intimate and inextricable. I started writing poetry around the same time I started doing the river work, and they're mutually. And it was the same time I met my partner Miriam, and all of those things are bound up together with care and love and mutual support. So yeah, I can't. My river poems, of course, they come out of they're me trying to think through what I'm doing when we're down at the river, you know. So yeah, they're very interrelated.
For both of you, it strikes me that there's an attempt in your poetry to presence narratives that may have been forgotten, and Kevin, you allude to that. Are there narratives right now that you're seeing starting to come out in poetry that you think are representative of something that's happening in our community right now, that are starting to be presenced in the work of London poets?
Well,
Go ahead.
well, you know, one obvious kind of narrative that has been absented and erased has been narratives of, Indigenous history, right? And so I've thought a lot about that, and I try to give space to that or expression to that thinking in my poems. That's the end of that river poem I read was all the tangled narratives. And I think that I'm trying to learn about those tangled narratives and think about ways to, give them some kind of voice, and that again, connects to actually being at the river and doing that kind of work and making relationships. I was invited to give a talk at Oneida about the river work that we do, and when of course I just learned so much more than I talked a little bit, but I was listening, and these are the narratives that I'm thinking about. So that's one that just comes up to me very quickly when I think about that. Yeah.
When you're in those circumstances where you're coming with knowledge ostensibly,
Yeah.
and you're bringing written work, for example, how do you find yourself existing when you know that you have so much listening that you also have to do?
That's interesting. Like, that should be just applicable across the board in any situation, right? When you're coming with something, you should probably, deliver half of it and just listen more. But so what's the question? How do you do that, or how do you
exist in that tension between knowing?
I think
that you're
existing
listening?
in tension is great.
Yeah.
I think that when you find yourself uncomfortable and kind of in tension and not really knowing what to do, and then having to ask people and make connections and learn, and then you're in the right place.
And I think poetry kind of invites that sense of tension, unknowingness, sometimes difficulty, right? Difficulties of interpretation and gaps is why poetry can be really effective for doing that type of work.
Yeah.
I read an interview, I think, that you did, I think it was with Poetry London, perhaps, or I can't remember who it was with exactly, but you referenced the long and storied metaphor of the kind of writing that you do, and the way that writing allowed certain things to be said without being said in a way that would sort of create danger for people. Do you see a role for that kind of metaphor in some of the issues that we're dealing with today in community?
In the sense of maybe not letting everybody in, or addressing only certain types of audiences, or?
I think maybe just the function of that kind of metaphor in sort of allowing a movement maybe to grow or to develop under the surface, and then to sort of be there and be present in real life.
Yeah, I mean, for me it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It's that type of that kind of coded language I was talking about in terms of like how do you express this kind of queer desire, right, historically. So on the one hand, that's part of the erasure, but then also it's really something beautiful. Like, there's a really long tradition of all sorts of different writers and artists, right, referencing this as a way of communicating and reaching out. And so that was the kind of tradition I was playing with. The problem is it might not reach everybody, or you have to kind of know the code to pick up on the code. So
That's interesting. Yeah.
that's great.
Well, maybe just look to the audience. Are there questions that are percolating in people's minds about the writing that these two gentlemen do? All right. I can keep going.
Angie's got a question.
Oh, perfect.
I was wondering if you could both talk about the role of art within your poems, because both of you made references to visual artists, or I know that Kevin, you do. So if you could maybe have a ballad about that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really interested in kind of ekphrasis, or writing that response to kind of visual works in different ways. There's a poem in the collection actually I wrote based on an exhibition I saw here a couple of years ago, the Margaret Watkins retrospective of her photographs. What is it for me? For me, it's a way of taking up a persona, I guess, or a different subject that kind of goes into this codedness that we've been talking about, so I can take on somebody else's name and say things that I might not say with the kind of traditional eye of the lyric, right? Or it becomes a bit of like a shorthand. So I have a poem about Jack Chambers' the 401 poem, and the way it kind of gets reflected in the rearview mirror, and that kind of was a springboard for kind of similar reflection.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, painting or sculpture, these things, can look at something that you're also interested in this other way that can then kind of like prompt prompt your response, and you can kind of like, oh, that's an interesting thinking about death, and now I want to think alongside of it. It's also, for me, it's just I could take students to art galleries to do ekphrastic exercises, and I do them at the same time, and generally something kind of good comes out of it, so I hold on to those. And they're great prompts, right? Because art they're thinking pieces, right? And then you just end up, I don't know, I end up in dialogue with painting and with visual art, and that dialogue comes out as a poem, and I think it can be really, as you know, because you do kind of the same thing, that can be really exciting.
And I wish I could do it myself, and I think maybe it's a way of like trying to so write about films and stuff like that.
And with the Damien Hirst piece, that was anger about. That was just anger, and he bugs me, but I also know he's doing interesting things, and so I think, but I was just pissed off about him killing these sharks, and so that was part of what was going on there. So he was provoking, and it worked.
So I think both of your poetry styles or the collections that you guys have cultivated can be boiled down into single word descriptors. Like Kevin, you could write queer poetry, and Tom, you could write environmental poetry. How do you guys feel about single word definitions of what you write? Do you think that they're helpful, or do you think that they're limiting?
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're really helpful. I think that they kind of, I think about those things, but then as soon as they're good, because then as soon as you define it, then the boundaries go blurry. So, so it's something that you do, and then you realize immediately that, like, oh, this thing that I do also bleeds into these other categories as well. And so, I also, I'm interested also in masculinity and queer spaces as well, and also the overlap with that and the environment, because I think that they're directly linked. And so I don't mind those labels at all. It depends whether it's someone trying to get a handle on your work, or you're trying to get a handle on your own. But I don't find them limiting. I'm just happy that someone's caring enough to give it a label.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a bit of a double edge, right? Because it can be reductive in one way. You don't want to only be seen that way. But I mean, especially for this book, I was so working in that tradition of all of these other great writers who I admired, right? That I was responding to or thinking about. And so, when it gets around to kind of writing the back cover copy and trying to appeal to as many people as possible, I was like, the book is just gay, gay, gay. So I'm fine with us just putting it out there. That's what it is. So, but.
I'll indulge in a question just to maybe go a little bit further along the line, Tom, with what you're saying about your interest in the intersection between masculinity and the environment and queer spaces. It struck me as I was thinking about our conversation that there maybe was something important that the three of us should be talking about as three men in front of a group of people, and it strikes me that might be part of what's important for us to be talking about. So I'm wondering if you two might reflect on those intersections a little bit.
Of intersections of
masculinity, the environment, and queer spaces, I think, were the three that we kind of named in that last salvo.
I can just say, I was really interested in, thinking a lot about kind of the colonial history in London, but specifically, obviously from my own kind of subject position, and became really caught up with the figure of the soldier and the sailor and how integral that was, but not the soldier, especially to London's history, and thinking about the kind of the garrison history, and that figure became a way for me of exploring that kind of fraught history, because the soldier is such a big figure in gay eroticism too, right? From erotica to porn, and it became a really interesting kind of iconography to think about.
One connection that I don't know really yet how to write about is the connection between environmental issues and social issues, because definitely in the work that we do cleaning up the river, we go down to the river, and the first time I did it I was like, okay, we're just going to pick up the garbage and leave, and of course we picked up 30 hypodermic needles, and then I was like, okay, we have to learn about why are these needles here, and why does the city give out 2.5 million needles a year, and why is this the place that people feel safe to come, and why is 50% of the stuff that we're picking up stuff that is left by people who are living rough along the river. This is stuff that, like, they're getting handed down, every time we clean our houses and throw our junk into the back of a car and then go drop it off at some place and just get rid of it. These things get passed down and they're given to people who are treated like trash in our society, and then create garbage as well, and the intersections there. And I've tried to write about that, but then you're getting into, I start to worry about like how you're using these kinds of experiences and representing these communities rather than trying to give them voice, or how to do that work responsibly. I don't know the answer, but those, again, I think it's okay to go in those directions where it's uncomfortable and to kind of make mistakes. I hope it's okay to make mistakes. But those are, like, that's one intersection that I'm thinking of. And I've written a poem about a man that we encounter regularly at the river, and I've never read it because I don't know about it yet. I don't know whether it's okay.
Any other questions?
Read a poem?
I think we should read poems.
Okay.
All right. You two can self-organize.
Do you want to go or do you want
Okay, I'll go. And then, thinking about masculinity and nature. The new poems that I'm writing about are focused on home. When I was a young man, I worked on a farm for many years, from probably the time I was about 12 to the time I was 30. All my summers and sometimes the whole year round, I worked on a farm. I was a teacher's kid, so I was kind of an interloper in that community, but it was how I kind of gained my identity as a young man, as someone who worked hard, as someone who was strong. It mattered to me that I could work hard and that I could kind of that I could be part of that community and play hockey and be a Huron County boy. And I'm thinking about that now because I've had enough time away from it, and just the work of what it means to work on a farm. Once a year we had to do this thing called processing cattle. This is called processing cattle. The dehorners curved like a flamingo's beak. Each time the heavy shear blades crunched down on a horn, I thought flamingo. I was a teacher's kid, so I learned from scratch. Horns had to go to get their heads through the feeders so they wouldn't gouge, gore each other, us. Balls had to go, bulls were harder to handle, meat too lean, no marbling or fat. We did it in January when there were no flies. Andy corralled a bull into the squeeze. Gil worked at the back with a scalpel, bucket of iodine and brush. Jim climbed the sides of the chute to ladle on the insecticide. I worked the front where their heads were caught in the catch. Glass, black, bovine eyes took in our tools, revealed nothing, buried what came next under bulging, convex self-portrait. We worked fast, flamingo, flamingo. Paul cut out the testicles, threw them in the yard for the dogs. I cocked the hormone gun, injected a column of hard pellets into the steer's right ear. The shorn arteries didn't start really pumping until after we released the catch and the steer was out in the barnyard with the others. standing shoulder to shoulder in the January sun, steam rising off their backs, rust dripping from their undercarriage, their breath filling the sharp air with exhaust, coats growing slick with blood from cartoon geysers pulsing on each side of their heads, the snow all around painted red, the whole winter scene painted hot and red. Thank you.
So this poem is called What Not to Wear, and it begins with an epigraph from Anne Carson's short talk on Ovid, and she writes, "Each night about this time, he puts on sadness like a garment and goes on writing." So what not to wear? As the exile dressed without mirrors, he exchanged a tunic for the elegiac couplet. Word-weary, I would tattoo a wilted pansy on my bicep, wear sweatpants in translation from a dead language. To say as much is silence. I unfold anxiety in triplicate, a screen in some well-appointed corner. The drop ball of Y-front briefs, a questioning desire. Lycra is optimism. Oxford, ire. Sleeveless tees shirk my heart and letters. A book on closet design suggests I ask the pairs of socks and trousers, do you bring me joy? Discard whatever vestments make me cry. So, goodbye forever, size 32 blue denim jeans, and the X is leather. I box my well-worn sentiment for the goodwill and deliver it, a prodigal from the laundromat, disguised by toque and sunglasses. Did Ovid at Pontus mount such obvious productions of himself, or simply shoulder the sad and foregone outfit, knowing a makeover is not a metamorphosis? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Kevin, and thanks to everybody for
Thank
being
you.
here this afternoon.
Thank you very much, yeah.